We will halve inflation, grow the economy, reduce debt.
Nothing's changed. The circus moves on, rinse and repeat.
We have an opportunity to become Europe's Silicon Valley.
We can perhaps be a broker of some sort with Ukraine.
We expect inflation to come off quite rapidly in the rest of this year. Obviously, we want to see that happen.
What we now need is a period of stable, quiet, serious government.
You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Stephen Carroll. It's just me here from the regular team today. We've cleared the decks to bring you a big interview, and the very special guest, Francine Lacqua, our editor-at-large, is here too. Hey, Fran.
Hi, Stephen.
Great
Love
to
being here.
Great to have you with us. I do feel like that your arrival signifies that I should sit up straight in my chair because you've come here to tell us something very important. But I think maybe do we need to rebrand that? Should we make this sort of?
I do. I don't want to be the Grim Reaper of news. So maybe the fun.
Yeah,
the
fun
fun
Reaper
has arrived at the margin.
We'll work on that. We'll workshop that later. But you're here because you are bringing us your interview with the former Prime Minister Theresa May. It's hard to believe it's been 4 years since she was in number 10. Premiership dominated by Brexit and, of course, the negotiations to leave the European Union. Amid those dramatic scenes that became almost commonplace in Westminster, will we ever see the likes of again? Francine, I'm really curious, when you started thinking about this interview, what moments sprung to mind for you from that premiership? Because there was so much that happened of import, but there was also so much else kind of happening behind the scenes that just led to this general sense of chaos.
Yeah, certainly chaos. And I remember, Stephen, so she has a book to sell.
Mm-hmm.
And so when our producers came out and saying, look, Theresa May will speak to Bloomberg, I thought, well, why is she writing this? And actually, when you think back, it was only a couple of years ago. It feels like a lifetime ago, because I remember at the time being quite traumatized about some of the events that were going on because it was hung Parliament, things were getting messy. And
we all learned so much about parliamentary procedure.
I mean, since we're used to it, there's no real chaos, that was less than what we had at the time. And so I wanted to reflect with her, but also before her. It's actually, why is she writing this book? Is it to settle scores? Is it to give herself a better reputation? And if you look at the prism of why does a prime minister write something, usually it is to give a message. So it's interesting that she chose the abuse of power. So in this book, she didn't really talk about Brexit. I mean, she talks about Hillsborough, she talks about sexual harassment, Windrush, Russia's illegal invasion. And partly she does reflect on her own failings. Her critics would say, look, that's not enough. But it was just a very, very volatile moment. And I think since we've gotten used to it, maybe it was really the beginning of the chaotic politics that now we have almost day in, day out. I mean, do you remember she was walking in the Rose Garden with President Trump and he was holding her hand, and we'd never really seen that before, right? It was one of the first times where you say, wait, what? What's going on? And then he attacked her, and then there was not physically, but in terms of words. And then there was those very, very, messy Brexit negotiations. So I would say it was really cementing the kind of politics henceforth of chaos and no real true diplomacy anymore.
Okay, well, let's take a listen now to that interview with Theresa May.
Theresa May, thank you so much for joining us on Bloomberg, and congratulations on the book. Who did you write that for?
I wrote it because a number of issues I'd come across when I was both Home Secretary and Prime Minister. When I left office and started reflecting on these issues, I realised there was a thread underpinning them. And I wanted to raise awareness about that thread, which was, as I say in the title of the book, the abuse of power. So I was really writing it for those who are in power, to say, actually, they need to think that they're in positions of service rather than power, but also, I think, to give hope to the powerless.
Do you think you had a hard time when you were in power?
Well, I had some difficult issues to deal with when I was in power, but every politician, when you're elected, when you become a government minister at whatever stage, you have to deal with the circumstances that you're presented with.
But with hindsight, do you feel vindicated? Because actually your strategy could have worked better than other strategy after you.
Well, I assume you're talking about Brexit strategy, which indeed, I mean, I'm on record as saying I think my deal was better than the deal that was finally concluded. But I couldn't get my deal through the House of Commons, so somebody else had to go have a go.
Yeah, but you were also personally, they said that you were maybe not as exciting as others. Boris Johnson proved to be very exciting, a little too exciting.
Well, I think it's interesting. It's one of the things that I think I took from my childhood. My father was a clergyman, so I was brought up in a country vicarage in Oxfordshire in the UK, and in that time, I sort of learnt that I wasn't just myself, I was representing, in a sense, my father. People looked at my behaviour and sort of saw my father through it, and similarly the church. And it's a little bit similar in politics, that as an individual, you're not just there as the individual, you're there as a representative of your party, of your government, and in international affairs of your country. And so I've always taken the view that one must be careful in the approach that I took to what I said and how I approached issues. And yes, some people said that wasn't very exciting.
But so does your style and the way you did business at the end, was it vindicated?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's a different way of doing business. Okay. I think it had worked to get some results that I thought were good. Others had a different style and came out with a slightly different result. What we will see in the future, of course, is as the country moves on, how the country deals with the situation that it's on. And that's important for us now in our economy and business is to move on.
Do you think you were held to a different standard because you were a female leader?
I don't think, I mean, I think there was some different expectations. Some of the male colleagues would, for example, have said, and sometimes actively said to me, and openly said to me, that when I was negotiating with the European Union, I should have been thumping the table, I should have been walking out of the room, I should have been slamming the door. Those very sort of aggressive ways of doing it. In fact, I had spent some years before I went into Parliament in a position where I was negotiating with the European Union, European Commission, and I'd learnt through that it was painstaking, slow, deliberate and careful negotiation on the details that got you where you wanted to be.
But has politics changed in the last 5 to 6 years? The way we communicate, the way diplomacy around the world, frankly, is done?
I think politics across the world has been changing in recent years. I say in the book, I think we live in a more absolutist world, a sense of you're either 100% with me or 100% against me. I think there are some in politics who find it difficult to accept the concept of compromise, whereas we know in politics, in business, in everyday life, sometimes you actually have to compromise. And I think there has been, in some senses, if you look at politics today, there's less respect than there has been in the past. Perhaps a coarser debate. I don't think that's good, and I think sometimes that puts young people off, which is not good for the future of our democracy.
What's your biggest regret?
Well, I have to say my biggest regret is not getting the deal I wanted to get through the House of Commons. And I think every Prime Minister leaves office feeling that there were things that they wanted to do. So some of the things I started have now been completed. I introduced a new Domestic Abuse Act, for example, which is now on the statute book. I did some work for a new Mental Health Act, which has not yet reached the statute book. We still have, that still has to be brought forward. So there are always things that, if you'd had a little more time, you hope you would have completed.
Did you feel at the time that the Brexiteers actually left it to the Remainers to get the job done because they didn't really have a blueprint of what they wanted?
Well, ultimately, I think some of them found it difficult to think that a Remainer, because I'd voted Remain, could deliver Brexit for them, and so therefore, obviously, after me, they went for Boris Johnson, who had led the Brexit campaign and was a Brexiteer. And during the debates and towards the end of my time, we saw sort of hardline Brexiteers looking for a very hard Brexit, hardline Remainers wanting a second referendum to stay in, and that's why Parliament couldn't come together.
Do you think we'll ever get a second referendum?
No, I think the decision has been taken, and I have always taken the view that if you ask the people their view and they give you their view, you should act on that. I think it was the democratic will of the people that we left the European Union. But I think now what we must be doing is saying, actually, we've done Brexit, let's stop thinking of life in terms of Brexit, let's move on and look for the future.
The ex-M&S boss, Stuart Rose, says Brexit will be reversed within 20 years. Do you think that's possible?
Well, I think a lot of people, when they look at that, are thinking of, if you like, the current circumstances of the European Union. Over the next 20 years, the European Union is going to change. Its structures will change, its membership will change. So it will be a different body. The UK will develop over that 20 years. If you look back, there's always been an issue, even since we first joined the common market as it was then. There's always been a slight concern in the UK, an island nation, about this sense of being sort of attached to a group in Europe, and that came to its head for a variety of reasons in the referendum. I think part of that was part of the wider political sense that we've had across the world of people feeling globalisation hadn't been working for them, some people had been left behind, and people in the UK wanted their politicians to change.
But looking forward 5-10 years, could you see an arrangement where actually the two are closer together?
Well, I think what we've already seen, for example, the UK negotiating to rejoin Horizon,
Science, yeah.
I think is a very good example of a recognition that sometimes there are things there that it's good to be part of, that in relation to the EU. And I think over time we will see those number of areas. There were some areas on the law enforcement side which I recognised as Home Secretary where I hope we'll be able to get greater access to some databases and things like that. But I think there's a recognition now of the need to sit down and say, well, what makes sense?
Right, and what do you think makes sense? And again, depending on what happens at the next election, do you think that will again be on the table? If not another referendum, certainly closer business ties.
I think over time governments will be looking to see what makes sense for economies on both sides, for the EU, but also for the UK economy and businesses in the UK as well.
Do you ever regret making Boris Johnson your foreign minister?
No, I was very clear when I set my cabinet that I needed to have a cabinet that was both Remainers and Brexiteers. The result of the referendum was clear, but it was close. And what I always wanted to do was to deliver Brexit, but a Brexit that recognised the concerns of the 48% who had voted to remain. Boris had led the Brexit campaign. I think therefore it was right that he was in the cabinet in a prominent role.
We've had quite an eventful, let's call it that, 12 months in UK politics, in UK business and UK markets. Do you think things have stabilised after the mini-budget of last autumn?
Yes, I think things have stabilised. I think Rishi, Jeremy Hunt being brought in as Chancellor, I think, was the first step, but Rishi taking over, obviously, as leader of the party and Prime Minister, with Jeremy in number 11, has stabilised matters. I mean, it's been difficult for economies around the world with the impact of the pandemic, and, we're all still coming out of that. But I think, and what I see, and what I hope markets and businesses see, is a UK government that recognises the importance of sound public finance.
If you look at the polls, is there any advice that you would give the current government to avoid a Tory wipeout at the next elections?
I think what Rishi Sunak is doing, which is saying, I've identified priorities, the priorities of the British people, and I'm working hard to deliver on those, is what he should be doing, and I think he's doing the right thing. Obviously, in economic terms, inflation is critical. We have a generation now, I'm old enough to have lived through inflation in the 70s, but there's a generation now who haven't lived through higher interest rates and inflation, and it has been difficult for many. Many people are struggling in their day-to-day life and their day-to-day finances. Bringing that inflation down is important.
Yeah, but what do you say to those voters that say, look, the Tories have had a good shot at this for a long time, and it's just time for a change?
What I say is, listen to the future that we want to create to ensure that the United Kingdom has. The future of jobs, future of prosperity, that is what we are looking to deliver. We've had these difficulties, pandemic hit economies, we're now stabilising that economy. And as you see from what, for example, Rishi is doing in terms of the AI conference, very much saying, what is the future? And how can we, the United Kingdom, be a good part of that future and encourage businesses in the UK to be part of that future?
You were very deliberate and precise in your dealings with China. Should Rishi Sunak have flown to China actually in the first year in office?
I think the debate about China seems to be in what I described earlier as those absolutist terms, that either you ignore China or you're completely sort of in with China. The answer is, of course, that it's right to be neither of those. You can't ignore China, huge economic presence across the world, although the Deputy Prime Minister identified it as the number one state-based threat to our economic security. But it's a huge presence economically for businesses, but also, of course, in terms of the way it has reached out across the world, sometimes being able to take a position in countries because the West has not been there. So we should learn from that, I think. But we have to balance. There are real human rights issues with China. You know, I'm involved in setting up a global commission on modern slavery. If you look at the recent global slavery index, it identified solar panels being created in China and labour exploitation behind those. So we have to look very carefully, and businesses can make a huge difference in looking at their supply chains.
But at the moment, do you think we're too hard on China? And is there a danger that if you look at the template of what happened with Russia in the Cold War, we're repeating that with China today?
Well, I think what was interesting if you think about Russia and the Cold War, is in a sense both sides knew where the dividing lines were and were able to, there was an existence that was able to go into the future with people understanding those dividing lines. And I think maybe we haven't quite got to that point with China. It's very interesting if you look at somebody like Kevin Rudd, former Australian Prime Minister, who's very knowledgeable on China. He sets out that as one of the potential ways forward.
President Trump had given you a hard time. What do you think a second presidency, if he wins the next election, means for the world?
Well, I'm not going to speculate on the result of an American presidential election, or indeed on the result of parties' candidates and who they choose for candidates. I mean, what I would say is that it was, I would say, a presidency like no other. When we saw President Trump in his position, and it was a more unpredictable, perhaps an uncertain presidency. I think what we see now, and in a sense the war in Ukraine has helped with this, is America again, with its Western allies, standing up for Western values.
But do you see abuse of power in the US?
What I worry about in the US is the polarisation of politics, what I would say the very hard line polarisation of politics. And I, as many around the world in democracies, were deeply concerned about the mob attack on the Capitol and what that meant for democracy. And I think it in a sense, was a wake-up call, because in recent decades, I think those of us in the West have taken the view that liberal democracies were in the ascendancy, that this was an accepted way forward, and we almost didn't need to worry. We became complacent. Actually, we have to fight. We have to work hard to protect democracies and to persuade younger generations in our own countries of the importance of democracy.
But are these cycles in the politics and foreign affairs of the world, or is it social media?
Well, I think you can argue that politics does have its cycles. If you look at the economic situation, many would say, I referred to the 1970s, many would say we're seeing that sort of cycle. But I think that my own view of social media does have an impact on these issues in terms of the nature of political debate. And I think it means that somebody whose views normally would perhaps be dismissed or not listened to can promulgate those views across social media, and other people similarly thinking will respond. It becomes a worldview. And the danger is that people only listen to people who have the same views as them and don't enter into what we need in politics, which is a respectful and serious debate, because we're all facing some really tough issues.
In your book, you talk about concrete examples and you unpick the kind of abuse of power. Do you think it will get worse before it gets better?
Well, I hope that having written the book, having, if you like, shone a light on this issue of the abuse of power, that actually people will start to say, yes, there is something there, what can we do to have a different approach? I mean, the fundamental of the book is that, I start off by saying, in an interview I'd said that being Prime Minister was not a position of power, it was a position of service. I think all those who are in politics are there in a position of service and should never forget that.
So why do young people not want to join politics? How difficult is it? Is it because you get dragged through the mud? And politics was always a dirty business, but what you're also getting at is that it's maybe harder now than it was 20 years ago.
I think that for a lot of young people, I think that the world is different to the world that perhaps I grew up in. I think there is an element of some people who don't go into politics, particularly, sadly, women who don't go into politics because of the bullying, the harassment, the threats on social media, for example, and feeling that that's not something they want to be part of or one of the recipients of. I think also for young people, often these days they're having to cope with some with really difficult times. I think we do see a younger generation who are now worried that they won't be better off than their parents. we've seen through time, every generation has hoped that its children will be better off. But now, you just look in the UK, how difficult it is for young people to own their own home, for example. As I said earlier, the impact of higher interest rates, of inflation, has been something they haven't had to cope with before. And I think that sort of day-to-day managing and a feeling perhaps that the politicians haven't responded to those needs, perhaps also is an element of putting them off politics.
You talk about the Metropolitan Police, you talk about Grenfell, you talk also about immigration. What are you most ashamed of in terms of policies that have been put in place, or the abuse of power in certain pockets of UK society?
Well, I think the underlying theme that I'm really concerned about is the sense of people in public institutions, which are often there to protect the public or to serve the public, deciding instead to take decisions that serve themselves rather than the public. So if you like, the idea for the book came from reflections I made after I'd left office, but was really sparked by Hillsborough. This was a sporting tragedy that happened in 1989. 97 Liverpool fans were killed. And after the tragedy, what we saw was, it was South Yorkshire Police in that case, altering witness statements, blaming the fans. We've now got to a point, thankfully, where the fans have been exonerated. But it's that sense that I want to draw out there and in other examples of people in the public sector in positions of power using that power for themselves and their institution, to defend their institution rather than to protect or serve the people that they are there to serve.
You've become a little bit of a meme celebrity, right, with the dancing? Which, is it something, I mean, do you...
Different descriptions of my dancing, by the way, from different people.
Do you regret the dancing?
I don't regret the dancing, no.
I know you also made global headlines talking about, the naughtiest thing you've done. Since you've left Number 10, have you done anything naughtier than running through fields?
Look, I have to say, if I was asked today what's the silliest thing I've done, probably answering that question was the silliest thing that I'd ever done.
So that was the former Prime Minister speaking to our editor-at-large, Francine Lacqua, and Fran's still with us in studio. I'm really glad you asked that question at the end about the wheat field, because it's one of those things that was actually quite central, first of all, to that election campaign, but to the measure of how people viewed Theresa May at the time, the sort of attempt to build what people understood of her personality, which of course was so central to what happened to the Conservative Party afterwards and the rise of Boris Johnson and everything that came afterwards. What stood out for you from that conversation?
Well, so the last couple of questions were very awkward when I asked her whether she knew that she was a meme because of the dancing. Yeah. And I remember at the time her being really personally attacked, not only because she was considered boring and awkward, but just because she didn't know how to speak to politicians. So it was interesting getting her to talk about whether she felt she was held to a higher standard because she was a woman. But then when you speak to also, the people that backed her, she was, and this we used to say at the time, and I think it's even truer now, she was dealt a rough hand at cards, but she dealt with it even worse. She never made the connection. She tried to get, the Brexiteers and the Remainers together without really ever being in charge. And so that I think really came across in the interview, that she didn't use her iron fist to get people in line, and maybe that's what we needed.
But it was really interesting, I think, how measured she was in talking about some of her colleagues, because we know of what was going on behind the scenes. We know it was vicious at times. And even when it came to Boris Johnson, she didn't really seem to have a bad word to say.
She didn't. So after the interview, I also spoke with Adrian Woolridge, who's very funny, from Bloomberg Opinion. And I asked, what did you think of the interview? And he says, well, it was interesting, but when you have so many former prime ministers writing books, and I think he mentioned Liz Truss is also writing a book about power and how to get the world. Well, apparently it's not shorter, although she only stayed in power just over 40 days. It's like you need to go after something. I mean, you need to make sure that the media and the book actually understands what your position is. And she was very careful. She didn't really go after Rishi Sunak. She didn't go after Boris Johnson. He, kind of stuck the knife in a couple of times. So I was surprised at her decorum. I don't know whether she's expecting to come out cleaner or whether she's just a classy act. Yeah. But I was surprised at how measured she was. She even said, she didn't regret putting him as foreign minister.
Yeah, which was, I think, really interesting. I mean, in such a wide-ranging conversation, is there anything you think that she said that would resonate in the ears of the current Prime Minister, particularly as we're looking towards an election, a very difficult election, perhaps something to be learned from Theresa May's experiences?
Yeah, so what stood out to me actually was that she talked about the Capitol riots as a watershed moment in the US for Western democracy. And I would have probably said that that would have come before, because we've had so many of those moments where President Trump was saying things that we weren't used to, that other G7 allies went, wait, what? That's coming from, the leader of the free world. And so the fact that she really pinpoints as that January event as somewhere which, she didn't really warn that it could be repeated elsewhere, but she said for her that changed her perspective on Western democracies and the fact that, we need to fight a lot more for what was a given in the decades before, that actually there is democracy and you didn't really challenge elections if you lost.
The comments on China too, so I think actually were the part that almost made the most headlines for me listening to this idea, given that we're talking about allegations of spying in Westminster at the moment. Very topical to hear her views on Britain's future relationship with China.
And it's very different from the US. I mean, if you speak to anyone in the US, be it Democrat or Republican, they want to go after China. Yes, it's an election cycle, so it's extremely difficult for them to be benign or certainly wanting to work around China to make sure that there's a deal. But she comes from it from someone who at the time tried to do economic deals. Again, she wouldn't, and I asked her, was it a mistake from Rishi Sunak not to fly to China in his first year in office? Because you kind of need them on side, be it geopolitics, be it Ukraine, being how to deal with Russia, be it, with the iPhones. And she wouldn't be drawn on that, but she said we need to find a working cooperation with China. So again, I thought she was much softer on China than I thought she would be.
The book title itself is quite provocative, The Abuse of Power. Overall, did you find her optimistic or pessimistic?
I think pretty pessimistic. I think very pessimistic. Because if you look at what she talks about, and it's sexual harassment, some of the scandals that really shook the UK, nothing really has gotten better. So I ask her, do you think it has to get much worse? Is this a cycle where it gets so bad at a point where there's a watershed moment and you realize, like, wait, what are we doing? She wouldn't be drawn out. I mean, she was maybe a little bit naive in saying, well, I hope people read my book and then change, especially politicians, and then become wiser and become more correct and stop abusing the power they have. I mean, do they ever really? But certainly it's an interesting conversation, to have. I mean, she's always very subdued. So she says, we're not here to have power. We're here to serve. Again, great. But then you also have to lead when you're in power. So you have to make sure that you have that leadership quality for people to follow.
A fascinating conversation. Thank you, Francine Lacqua, for bringing us your interview with the former Prime Minister Theresa May. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe. Give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen. This episode was produced by James Woolcock. Our audio engineer was Maruf Hussain. I'm Stephen Carroll. Special thanks to Francine Lacqua. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.